So I am doing something a little bit different this time, and rather than talking about the tabletop game or doing a painting tutorial, I want to talk about some of the rarest Bretonnian models out there. Games Workshop has produced some obscure models every now and then, and for the longest time, Bretonnia, it was not a very loved IP of theirs. In this video, I'm going to go over a list of 5 of the more obscure and rare Bretonnian models, and hopefully you see something you've never seen before. So let's get right into it. So at number 5, we have Solomon Le Saracen, and no, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right. Of all the models I want to share with you today, this one is by far the least rare, and it's probably a model you've already seen before, but it's just so unique I still wanted to share it. Originally released in the mid-90s alongside his Bretonnian companion, Ordo de Outremer, and no, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right either, Solomon is one of the few rare Araby models made by GW. Lore-wise, Solomon and his companion come from the errantry war that Bretonnia waged against Jafar in Araby in the distant past of Warhammer Fantasy. So as the story goes, Solomon fought against the Bretonnians in their errantry war. However, he grew disenchanted with the Sultan's corruption and evil nature and eventually switched sides after seeing how chivalrous the Bretonnian knights could be, becoming the banner brother of this Ordo, eventually even returning to Bretonnia with him. A minor character to be sure, but he did have roles in the Bretonnia 5th edition army book. Well, kinda. He had to be taken with Odo, but he was in the book. And not that it really matters these days, but it's weird that they were only able to be taken as a group in the tabletop games because they were often sold in separate blisters. But hey, that's Games Workshop for you. Today, the model is still pretty easy to find on eBay and other secondhand sellers, but it's getting more and more expensive. And the chances of this model getting a reprint are basically zero. Games Workshop appears to have zero desire to revisit the culture of Araby in any of their media or tabletop games. Mostly all the land has been given to the Tomb Kings. And even if they did, a character like Solomon might be a little controversial in 2024. His defining characteristic is abandoning his own culture and becoming slavishly devoted to a Christian crusader stand-in. That's a little problematic these days. And so for those reasons, if you want to possess this model, now is the time to do it. A month ago is probably better because this sculpt is going to get rarer and rarer and a reprint is just not going to happen. It's safe to say this model will never receive official rules for the old world, but he could make a very cool champion for some of your Knights of the Realm units, especially if you're doing something like the Exiles, and it could also be a fun conversation piece. At number 4, we have the Bretonnian organ gun. And this one is rare enough it's hard to even find a painted image with the original crew. If you are at all familiar with the lore of Bretonnia, you probably recognize this model as very iconoclastic. Largely due to how their greatest champion died, Bretonnia views ranged combat as incredibly dishonorable. They utilize archers and trebuchets, but that's only for the peasantry. A chivalrous knight would never do such thing, and they have no interest at all in anything to do with gunpowder or gunpowder units. At least on land anyways, and in some lore sources, gunpowder and crossbows are even illegal in Bretonnia. And this is partially why the Bretonnian exile list is so fun. It's Bretonnians who aren't playing by their own ridiculous rules and are able to take extra units, including a cannon, which is why another rare old unit, the Bombard, is in demand now and is constantly being sold on eBay. But returning to the model at hand, this organ gun has no place in a modern Bretonnia list and is a relic of a time when the lore behind Bretonnia was very, very different. Bretonnia, as we know it now, didn't really come about until the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy and wasn't truly fleshed out until the 5th edition. This model was released in 1990 and comes from a time when Bretonnia was mostly just another antagonist for the Empire. It was very much still coded with knightly orders, but its nobility was infested with massive amount of Slaanesh cults to the point where they were basically Slaanesh worshippers. It is my assumption that at this time, Bretonnia was more inspired by the decadent French courts of the 1700s, whereas now we have a Bretonnia more inspired by Arthurian legends and knights from the 12th century. But this old interpretation of Bretonnia was never really that fleshed out either. And while they had an army list, it wasn't really a full supported army, making the miniatures that were printed for Bretonnia very rare. Chances of this model getting a new made-to-order run from GW is probably pretty close to zero. This unit still has no place in any modern Bretonnian list. And the sculpt itself is way older than anything I've seen GW do a made-to-order run for. So if you want this model, you will have to resort to the secondhand market, and if they know what they have, you are probably looking at paying at least $250 for a complete set, and probably way more than that if it's unopened. If you are a collector of all things Bretonnia, this is a really cool model to have, and a really interesting look at what Bretonnia might have been if Games Workshop went in their original direction. But due to its rarity and expense, if you're not an avid Bretonnia collector or a rabid Oldhammer fan, this model is probably best remembered as an interesting tidbit rather than trying to find it, source it, and pay for it for your own armies. At number 3 on my list, I'm showing you the very rare Bretonnian Wizard model. And this one's rare enough, it's hard to even find a picture of this model painted, and I can't find a decent one at all. Produced in roughly the same era as the previous Bretonnia organ gun, this model is very, very unique. Originally, it was sold in a kit called the King's Retinue, and like the organ gun before it, this model happened before GW settled on an identity for Bretonnia. In the Bretonnia we know and enjoy, you will not find a male wizard. So this design decision likely came about as a way to make Bretonnia stand out from the Empire, but in Universe there are no male spellcasters legally allowed in the lands of Bretonnia. In lore, children born in Bretonnia who show the signs of being gifted with magical abilities are kidnapped by the agents of the Lady. This is a lot less whimsical than what happens to Harry Potter. The little girls who are kidnapped are eventually returned to Bretonnia, and they come back as damsels, as prophetesses, as advisors to kings to help lead the country. However, in Universe, it is a big mystery to what happens to the little boys who were kidnapped in this way, and they are collectively known as the Lost Sons of Bretonnia. Although this was eventually retconned in the original lore, these lost sons were kidnapped by wood elves, cursed to never grow up, and forced into a life of slavery. As the years came on, they would forget about their biological parents and their previous lives, and being slaves to the wood elves would be all they knew. This was a very dark aspect of Bretonnian lore, and a very dark side to Warhammer's wood elves. You see, at the time, Bretonnia was strongly hinted to just be a puppet state for the Wood Elves. Their entire culture and religion was just a plot by the Wood Elves to mold them into what the Wood Elves wanted them to be. Taking these magically gifted children was just an extension of that. It was a way to mold these young girls into something useful for the Wood Elves, and a way to remove these young boys as being a potential threat in the future. Although Games Workshop dropped a lot of hints to this effect, they really kind of kept it as a mystery. The closest thing we have to a confirmation comes from the 2006 Warhammer Role-Playing RPG supplement for Bretonnia. In this book, if you had a Wood Elf or a High Elf in your party, they could recognize the Fey Enchantress as just being a Wood Elf. Eventually, Games Workshop decided to go in a different direction for Bretonnia, and a lot of this old lore, even though it's pretty cool, has been retconned. The Fey Enchantress is now officially human, and the fate of the Lost Sons is not so grim. In 2016, a short story was published that changed the old lore of the Lost Sons of Bretonnia. Rather than being doomed to being servants of the Wood Elves, the magically gifted Sons of Bretonnia were taken in by the Lady and her servants to be trained as her personal knights and bodyguards, and play the role as a powerful hero rather than a victim. But old lore, new lore, it doesn't really matter. The point is, there are no sanctioned official male wizards in Bretonnia, which makes this model a really interesting tidbit. And like the Oregon gun, it's a relic of when Bretonnia had a different path and a different idea behind it. There is an incredibly small chance that this model gets brought back as a made to order at some point, just because with the new Bretonnian Exiles list, this technically is a legal model. However, given the age of this model, there's a really good chance Games Workshop no longer has a working mold for it. So the most likely outcome is this model never gets another run, and the stock that is out there is all there will ever be. If you do decide you want to collect this model, you're going to have to work for it. Not only is a sculpt rare enough on its own, but when people do sell it, it is often mislabeled as an Empire Mage, making it incredibly difficult to source on online retailers like eBay. And even if you can find it, you're likely to face stiff competition from other collectors. But you have to admit, a Bretonnian Exile list with an actual Bretonnia wizard would be pretty damn cool. So we are now down to my last two entries on this list, and I gotta admit, I'm really excited to talk about both of these models. And at number 2, we have the Hermit Knight of Malmont. This model is about as rare as they come. This was only produced for sale for the French Games Day in 1997, and it is estimated only about 800 of these models exist. And not only is it ultra rare, but it's also a pretty unique aspect of Bretonnian culture that's not really explored in the tabletop. Hermit Knights have popped up from time to time in the books and other media, but on the tabletop, this is the only official Hermit Knight model Games Workshop has ever released, at least so far. The closest other model to it is a really cool conversion that GW made and showed how they did in White Dwarf number 288. Lore-wise, these Hermit Knights are generally older Grail Knights. After a lifetime, or in some cases several lifetimes of service of fighting horrors, they kind of just retired to do their own thing, and usually that's guarding small villages or Grail chapels. It's just a cool little dark aspect of the lore that these Grail Knight, these basically living saints after seeing so many horrors and seeing so many loved ones die, just kind of wander out on their own but still do whatever they can to serve their goddess. It's a shame this model was so limited in its production runs because it's such a fun model from GW and does an amazing job of capturing the idea behind a Hermit Knight. The biggest problem with this model, especially for collectors, is it is almost impossible to find a legitimate original copy of this, and when you do find one, they often go for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And when I say finding an original is hard, I mean it's damn near impossible. The marketplace is absolutely flooded with recasts, and it is pretty common for these recasts to be sealed in what looks like original GW packaging and then sold for hundreds of dollars themselves, even though as recasts they're really worth almost nothing. The cheapest price I can find for one of these models, which is very, very likely a recast, is $60, which is pretty absurd for a recast price. And I wish I knew of a way to tell the recast from the original, but I really don't. It's very hard to do. My best advice to you if you're trying to buy one of these models is buy them from somebody legitimate. Don't go through eBay. And if the price seems too good to be true, it most likely is. That being said, I think for most collectors, a recast model is perfectly fine. If you just want to have a version of this model and to be able to paint it, I mean, by all means, buy a recast. Just go into it with your eyes open and knowing that it's not an original. I will say the model is a blast to paint and is perfect for a game like Mordheim, or you could even place them with your Foot Knights if you're playing the old world. It's truly a very cool model, and I really, really wish more of them were made. But that does leave me with one last model to talk about, and the personal holy grail of my collection that I've yet to find. The 2005 Bretonnian Knight bust made by Forge World. Although discontinued in 2023, Forge World used to be a quasi-independent branch of Games Workshop that focused more on models for hobbyists. Basically, any model that was niche or resin or would be massively expensive was given over to Forge World to do. And one of the fun projects they used to do were these busts of various Warhammer characters. They never sold well and they're all pretty rare, but there are basically busts of all types. You can get Imperial Guard bust of a Slayer, there's a Skaven bust. There are a lot of cool busts out there, but none I want more than the Bretonnia Knight done in 2005. Obviously, having no value for the tabletop game, these larger statues and figures were just made for enthusiasts or for people who wanted a painting challenge. Collecting any of the Forge World busts these days is not an easy task. Even the more common ones sell for at least $100, and if you can find an unpainted, unopened one, you're looking at hundreds and hundreds of dollars. But I have yet to see the Bretonnian Knight model even show up for any kind of auction sale on sites like eBay or its ilk. And if there is a recaster out there doing this model, I haven't seen it. Personally, I would love to get my hands on this model and would probably pay an obscene amount of money for it. Enough that I'm not going to give a figure because I know my wife watches these videos. It is probably the rarest thing that was ever produced for Bretonnia, at least as far as my knowledge goes. If somebody knows how to get their hands on this thing, recast or otherwise, please let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching. I know this was a little bit different than the content I usually do, but I had a lot of fun making it. I hope you enjoyed watching it.